March 1945. The train that carried them pulled into a small siding in rural Georgia and let them down with the soft, disgraced rattle of old wheels and freight doors. Pine stood thick beyond the wire, the air smelling of resin and diesel and the damp, cold breath of early spring. They had traveled weeks, perhaps months. Hunger had hollowed faces into wartime maps, and silence had grown into its own language among them. They expected shouting. They expected a guard's boot and a slam of a hatch. What they had been told of prisoners of war as enemies left a hard taste in the mouth. What greeted them instead unsettled that taste. Warm blankets, measured voices, and a kindness that came in small, unannounced increments. If this story matters to you, subscribe and stay to the end. There are more hidden histories like this one, and your support helps bring them forward. Lieutenant Harris stood on the platform in a plain coat, a stack of papers under his arm, and a quiet that was not unsure. Beside him, a handful of medics and Red Cross volunteers moved with a practiced tenderness. A woman unrolling wool blankets, a nurse balancing a tin of soap and a box of toothbrushes. They wore the same uniforms that had seen Europe and the Pacific. Their gestures, however, were measured toward people who had the enemy's face. Anna watched them first. She had not slept properly in days, eyelids thin and brittle, hair pinned so tightly it was nearly a habit of shame. She kept her hands clasped around a small parcel that had no weight but felt necessary, as if holding something could keep her identity from dissolving. "Name?" the clerk asked, and the sound of their own language made some in the group still. Others kept their heads bowed, translating the sounds into a private ledger of loss. Marta was already cataloging the scene in her head the way she once cataloged patients. Who needed immediate attention? Who would lie and say they were fine rather than be a burden? She had been a nurse before the war, calluses on the inside of her palms that no bombing could erase. Now she moved almost automatically among the disembarking women, fingers checking pulses under sleeves, peering at tongues and lips for the long, quiet signs of dehydration. When a medic offered her a chair, she sat without complaint, eyes following a young guard who handed out small bars of soap as if they were medals. The camp itself was called Camp Crawford on the official forms, an assembly of wooden barracks, a mess hall that smelled of frying fat and coffee, and a bathhouse that was, in other years, merely practical. In March, with the sky still cool, that bathhouse would become for many something like revelation. It had wooden stalls and a corridor where steam pooled like low white clouds. The water, hot at the turn of a valve, hit skin with a sound that was at first a small, incredulous noise. Some women laughed when the first blast warmed them, a sound that might as well have been a prayer. Elise stood at the threshold of the bathroom longer than the others. Her hands were calloused from factory work at home. She used those hands now to push a damp lock of hair back from her brow, to steady herself in the swirl of steam. When a volunteer held out a towel, thin and surprisingly clean, she hesitated. The volunteer, a churchwoman named Mrs. Baird, who smelled faintly of starch and lemon, waited without speaking, hands folded in a small, respectful way. Elise took the towel as if it were an accusation, and then as if it were a benediction. She wrapped it around herself, and the warmth moved through her like a tide. They had been taught to distrust gifts. To accept mercy was to admit defeat. But the towels, the hot water, the soap, each small thing unmade a belief that cruelty was inevitable. Anna, who had at first kept to herself, let the heat coax out of her a quiet tremor that caught the corner of her mouth and turned into a sob so soft the nurse had to put a hand on her shoulder to be sure it was real. "I did not know whether to cry or be ashamed," she said later, a line that would be written into reports and later repeated by historians as testimony. The sentence landed without melodrama. It was honest and small, and therefore heavy. The mess hall was the next test. Expectation here was twofold. First, that food would be rationed and grudging. Second, that any feeding of enemies would be a performance meant to humiliate. Instead, the long tables were set with tin plates that steamed in the cool air, and a cook, hair tied back, a woman with flour on her forearms, moved along the line ladling scrambled eggs that smelled of butter and salt. Bacon sizzled in a pan, and someone cracked open a box of oranges, their citrus scent cutting the lingering diesel. The effect of the first warm meal was physiological and moral at once. A woman who had not eaten proper eggs in months closed her eyes as the yolk slid warm and bright along her tongue. The simplest tastes acted as signposts. Somewhere between the steam and the eggs, trust began to map itself. Food returned decision as much as it restored flesh. Camp Crawford operated on a small system of camp script, paper tokens that could be spent at the canteen. For the women, spending meant choice rather than charity. A bar of chocolate, a cigarette, a small soap. The ability to purchase with one's own token, even when those tokens had been given by the camp, reinstated a sense of agency that hunger had taken. Marta watched a young woman linger by the sweets shelf, fingers trembling above a pack of gum, and then choose a small notebook instead. It surprised Marta less than it might have surprised a soldier. The restoration of dignity rarely announced itself with a flourish. It arrived in the quiet exchange of a coin for a book. Medical examinations were not the invasive, punitive procedures some had feared. They were thorough and kindly. Nurses recorded weight and hydration, but they did so with explanations. A patient's chart folded into a conversation. "We'll get you back on something like a routine," a medic told one woman, using the language of repair rather than scolding. Where there were skin irritations and lice, common and grim facts of crowded transport, the treatment was efficient rather than theatrical. No one turned the procedure into public shaming. Instead, the medic offered treatments in private, handed out combs and ointments with the same gravity as giving someone clean sheets. Work assignments gave structure and an opportunity for usefulness. The camp garden, a small plot behind one barrack, needed tending. A sergeant who had a soft way with the soil showed them how to plant rows and how to use old crates as planters. "We expect the work to be honest," he said. "We pay camp script for it." Doing something that produced visible results, watching a seed pushed into the earth and then sprout, offered an antidote to the helplessness that war enforced. The women who had been factory hands or seamstresses found their fingers relearning rhythm, and laughter threaded through their movements like a stitch. There were still rules. Roll call was precise. Guards supervised the perimeters. Yet order was not indistinguishable from hostility. Discipline was a framework that allowed for safety. Lieutenant Harris enforced regulations with the same firmness he used to enforce humane treatment. When a rumor spread that letters would be opened, he curtailed panic by establishing a clear, respectful process. Private delivery, time for reading, the presence of a translator if needed. Mail call became a ritual that revealed how private joy or sorrow could undercut wartime narratives. A letter from a husband, written in hurried ink, could be a lifeline. A telegram might be a cold, bureaucratic cut. The contents were never trivial, and they refracted back through the camp. When a woman read that her brother had been killed, the camp offered a space for grief rather than a stage for spectacle. When another received a crude note of indifference, she folded it away and made room for the small consolations the camp provided. Small gestures mattered. A guard fetched a book from the meager barracks library when he saw Marta standing idle. A cook saved a piece of pie for a woman who had given up, several times, on finishing her plate. Volunteers from a nearby church organized English lessons and hymn singing in a hall that smelled faintly of lemon oil. They did not preach conversion so much as offer companionship. Words, the volunteers believed, could be bridges. The women learned names of streets in Savannah or Atlanta, new phrases that made American life feel less like a foreign sermon and more like a place with accessible doors. At night, the barracks creaked and breathed with human stories. Bunks held bodies that had been through other winters and other bombardments. In the half-light, conversations drifted between confession and practical planning. Who would write home? Who would save the camp script for a parcel? Who would risk asking for more soap? Anna told a small truth. I thought they would be cruel. I thought they would not listen. And Marta answered with the kind of practical optimism that comes from tending others. They listen. You have to let them. It was not a simple command, it was a careful invitation. The bathhouse had done most of the heavy moral lifting. Water had, in that place, become a symbol of renewed measure. Steam erased the outline of past indignity and offered a quiet space in which shame could be washed thin. After the tubs and towels, the women moved into the mess hall with a new posture, shoulders less tight, the habit of guarding words loosened. The camp's choices, the provision of hot water, the careful distribution of food, the small economy of camp script, functioned like a series of soft arguments against the narrative that enemies must be treated as less than human. They were arguments stated through action, not rhetoric. Yet not all transformation was immediate. Trust remained a process. Some letters reopened wounds instead of closing them. Rumor and fear took up residence in corners where sunlight rarely reached. There were moments when a woman would recoil at a volunteer's touch, then apologize for the recoil, ashamed of the instinct that had kept her safe in another life. The camp staff learned to be patient with such reflexes. They learned to stand at a respectful distance, to offer choices instead of commands. Lieutenant Harris learned to watch for the small signs. A foot turned toward the door, hands clenched on blankets. He learned to hold back until the person in front of him chose to move. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the mess hall's long windows and pooled like gold on the cracked linoleum, an event gathered the attention of many. A mail pouch had arrived late, its leather soft from use, and a sergeant moved through the rows with a list. Women stood as needed, their faces modulated by hope and dread. Anna sat with a towel still loose around her shoulders, the steam from the morning still clinging to her hair. She had chosen a notebook in the canteen earlier, its pages still stiff with silence. When the sergeant called a name, she rose slowly. A letter in his hand looked smaller than the silence that accompanied it. She broke the seal with fingers that did not stop trembling. For a moment the room held its breath, as if the simple act of opening paper could tilt history. The words inside were ordinary and brutal all at once. A sentence about the shortage of food at home, a line about a cousin safe in another village, a name struck from a list. Anna read aloud only the lines she had to, voice even though her throat quivered. Around her, other women listened because their own letters had given them to each other in that way. Reading, sharing, folding back into self and then into the room. What they read next would not be a tidy closure to hunger or fear. It would complicate the fragile trust they had built. It would force some to confront choices that went beyond the camp. But in that moment, in the mess hall washed with light and the smell of citrus, there was a small, unarguable fact. The way they had been treated at Camp Crawford had altered them. It had not cured every wound nor undone every loss, but it had placed, like a gentle hand, a foundation under what remained of their dignity. And for many, that foundation would prove as consequential as any relief shipment or official order. The blanket on Anna's lap was not merely warmth, it was a permission to feel human again. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, voices rose and fell like the tide, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp. The next knock at the barracks would bring another letter. Another choice would present itself. The rhythm of the camp continued: roll call, work, meals, yet each ordinary sequence now carried with it a new potential. The possibility that humane treatment could be not merely a temporary reprieve, but a way to remake expectation. For those who had come expecting cruelty, the daily accumulations of care had begun to rearrange the architecture of hope. And still, as dusk settled and the lamplight took the edges off the faces around the bunks, conversations turned toward uncertain futures. Some planned for return, some for waiting, some for whatever the war and its aftermath might allow. Marta wrote in the notebook she had bought. Small things, lists of seeds to plant when they could, a recipe for yeast bread that tasted like childhood. Elise tucked her towel under her pillow and, for the first time in months, let herself imagine a morning without fear. Lieutenant Harris walked the rows before lights out, a quiet sentinel who had learned that authority could be exercised with restraint and compassion. He paused at Anna's bunk and did not speak. The pause was its own recognition. The day had transformed more than bodies. It had made room for thought. That dignity is not only given in moments of grandeur, but in repeated, modest acts. It had suggested, gently and insistently, that policy and personhood need not be antagonists. And as night layered itself over Camp Crawford, the smell of coffee cooling in a pot and the silence easing into sleep, those who had arrived expecting the worst held, in the hollow of their chests, something they had not expected to keep: an ember of trust, fragile and guarded, but real. Dawn came soft and slow, as if the sky itself hesitated to decide between light and memory. The pines beyond the wire stood still, their silhouettes like slow witnesses. Inside the barracks, the women moved with a kind of reverence, small, careful motions that preserved the order they had learned to trust. Kettles hissed. A child laughed, abrupt and startling. Threads of steam rose from bowls of thin porridge and ghosted the rafters. Anna padded to the small window, the notebook under her arm. She opened it at the page where Marta had drawn a rough sketch of the seed packets she wanted to trade. Beans, a scrap of wheat, a few bulbs someone had found wrapped in oilcloth. The lines Marta had made, neat, spare, looked like hope transcribed into measurable things. Anna wrote beneath them in a hand that felt both foreign and familiar. If we go, take bread. If we stay, plant in center patch. She folded the page at the corner, pressing the crease with 2 fingers as if making a map. Outside, a sergeant moved along the path with a clipboard. His face was set in that particular neutrality the camp required. Not cruel, not tender, only efficient enough to be believable. He paused by the infirmary where Elise was bending over a small cot, massaging an old woman's swollen feet. For a moment their eyes met, Elise's bright and brittle, and then Elise shook her head almost imperceptibly, as if refusing to be caught in pity. Word traveled by small circuits. Some names were called yesterday, more might be called today. The letters had done something more than instruct. They had reintroduced fate into the women's days. Fate, before, had been implacable and heavy. Now it arrived in envelopes and lists, in choices that demanded response. Some names meant release, some meant transfer, some meant the redrafting of long-held plans. No one could say which would prove kind or cruel. Lieutenant Harris stood at the edge of the camp map table, hands deep in his coat pockets, watching a sunbeam cut across the inked lines. He had spent an odd hour the night before listening to the women read, feeling the pull of their voices like a tide. The restraint he practiced had become a muscle. The word authority had shifted beneath his fingers into something less absolute. But authority remained authority. There were reports to send, routines to maintain, a chain of command that tightened in unfamiliar ways the more he softened at edges. "You're thinking too much," Sergeant Doyle said when Harris rose from the map as if to leave a weight behind. Doyle was blunt-eyed, a man whose jokes were often clumsy shields. "They'll call names, we'll do what we do. Keep the rows straight, keep the men polite. It isn't harder than 1,000 other things." "It feels harder," Harris said. He allowed himself that honesty because Doyle had a face that could take it without flinching. Doyle's very bluntness made him practical in the way Harris needed. "It feels like, if we make this place too comfortable, it becomes harder to move them when orders come." Doyle looked at him, then at the barracks, where a woman hummed under her breath and a child did a clumsy pirouette on a small knotted rug. "Orders aren't cruel for the sake of cruelty," he said after a pause. "They're confusing more than anything. But you know what? People leave better when they're calm. Better for them, better for us. There's planning in mercy. Men like to forget that." Harris wanted to argue, wanted to say that mercy deserved a defense beyond utility, but instead he went outside. The cold air hit him like a reproach. He walked the perimeter, noting small things. A nail that needed hammering, the way a portion of wire sagged near the south gate, a squirrel brazenly nosing among the ration boxes. He stopped by Anna's bunk without intending to, drawn by the idea that such ordinary presences might anchor him. She was awake, hands folded on the blanket, looking at the small bundle of letters on her lap. She did not speak immediately. Her silence had been a language she used now, a way of measuring whether she had the courage to say what she felt. Finally she asked, "Do you think they'll let us keep this place if the list says otherwise?" Harris looked out toward the trees and said honestly, "I don't know, that's the truth. But if I can put a hand where it helps, I will." He did not mention the inspection he had been briefed about, an administrative review from headquarters which could look askance at the informal kindnesses he had allowed. The words sat in his chest like a bitter seed. Saying them aloud might have turned them into a justification for inaction. Anna nodded once, a small conceding movement. "Then put your hand," she said simply. There was no plea in it. It was an arrangement. The world has many mercies, she thought, and some can be accepted without shame. As the day wore on, small economies of exchange took place across the camp. Women traded knitting for time at the small radio someone had managed to coax into reception. A mother traded a jar of preserved plums for an extra ration of soap. A seamstress promised repairs for the boots of the men who helped her gather wood. The camp's life hummed with barters and favors, with the soft architecture of mutual need. Marta taught 3 children by the latrine, sitting on a wooden crate and drawing letters in the dirt with a charred twig. "A is for apple," she said, her voice patient as if repeating a lesson she wanted to keep alive like a song. The children repeated, some shyly, some with the fierce insistence of the young. When Marta glanced up, she caught Anna watching her, and there was a shared acknowledgement. To teach them to read was to give them a tool in a world that might fold or unmake them at any moment. It was not grand. It was essential. Around the midday meal, the sergeant called a small group to the notice board. Names were pinned under a heading that read, simply, Transfers. Each name became a pulse in the room. A woman who had once been a nurse, a young mother, an older woman with rheumatism. Anna watched faces as they registered the announcements, some flushed with hope, some with a muted despair that seemed to hollow their bones. A few brushed their hands over the names as if feeling for texture. Elisa's name was on the list. When she read it, her hands did not shake. She folded the paper with equal parts care and resignation. She had family elsewhere in the country, a sister who had written of sharing a cottage, There was a brightness in Elise now that had not been there before. The possibility of rebuilding, of being useful again. She stood up and told no one, then wrapped a small piece of cloth around a bar of soap and handed it to an older bunkmate without a word. Not all transfers meant salvation. Some were simply movements from one uncertain place to another, across lines of policy and compassion. A rumor began to circulate that one of the centers beyond the mountains had become strict, that the men there were less patient, less inclined to permit the small liberties Camp Crawford had cultivated. The rumor worked like a cold wind through the barracks, making some clutch closer to what they had, and others yearn harder for the unknown. That afternoon, a convoy arrived, 2 trucks that shuddered and panted as they took the turn into the camp. They came without fanfare, which made their presence feel more unavoidable. Guards moved with the mechanical efficiency of people whose minds had been trained to avert emotional surfaces. The truck's canvas flaps were rolled down, windows shuttered. When the drivers stepped out, their faces were unreadable. The group chosen to leave was gathered with a hushed dignity. They packed the smallest of parcels, perhaps a tin with a spoon, a sweater, a photograph wrapped in waxed paper. The air seemed to tighten as they filed, one by one, toward the trucks. Anna thought of the notebook and pushed it into her bag, the pages clinging together like the memories she intended to keep. Marta took a small jar of seeds and folded it into her apron. Elise adjusted the scarf about her neck. The scarf had been given to her by a woman who had said, "Wear this when you want to remember that the world can be soft." Harris watched them board, noting how their movements held a peculiar mix of resolve and fragility. When the last woman climbed up the truck, the canvas was drawn shut, and the vehicle rumbled away, a small, temporary removal that felt like an incision. The camp swallowed the space they left as if it were a wound that might scar over. That night, the women gathered in smaller knots, talking low about what the outward world might be like. A conversation started about how decisions were made, about the lists, the letters, the external forces that could bend a life. The talk had the inevitability of people speaking to the only thing that could make sense of their situation, the rules by which they were judged. Anna opened her notebook and read aloud the lines she had written earlier in the day. The pages smelled faintly of coffee and dust and the oil used to keep pencils from splintering. She read of seeds and bread, of a possible small garden patch behind the laundry. When she read, the room listened as if to a spell. The pages were more than tracing, they were a plan for living. A man, a relief worker who had been visiting the camp intermittently, came to speak with Harris the following morning. He carried with him a folder thick with paper and an earnest look. He suggested possibilities: transfers of supply, a petition to move the infirmary, an appeal that might secure additional blankets. Harris listened, feeling the familiar tug of 2 truths: that bureaucracy could be a means of care, and that bureaucracy could also be a cage. The relief worker was sincere but constrained. His language betrayed someone who had learned to say perhaps 100 times. "Can you ask them," the relief worker said finally, "to leave the activities, the sewing, the gardens, any program that keeps community intact? If the inspectors come, they'll be looking for order, showing that the women are occupied, that there are routines." He stopped, searching for a word that would make his meaning kind and less like a ledger item. Harris answered, "They are alive because of those things. If we remove them, we remove the reason they rise in the morning. I am trying to balance the two." Outside, a girl ran barefoot across the yard, carrying a tin that clanged with what must have been stones. She darted past a guard who watched her with something close to indulgence. For Harris, the scene was proof enough. The small liberties preserved living, and living made the camp legible in the human way he believed a command should be legible. The inspection came not with the swagger of officialdom, but with the quiet precision of people who had been trained to read surfaces for compliance. They arrived in neutral coats, each paper pressed and polished. They asked the right questions, tasted the soup, inspected the medicine cabinet. Harris met them in the mess hall and answered with the patient facts he had rehearsed: numbers, procedures, inventories. He watched their faces for the flicker that would tell him whether they'd seen the human work being done or only the arrangement of tables and chairs. At one point, the lead inspector paused by Marta's small teaching circle. The children, having been told to be particularly obedient for the day, sat straighter and recited the alphabet with the solemnity adults had demanded of them in other times. The inspector's eyes softened. Perhaps he remembered being small. He asked Marta how long she'd taught, and Marta answered, with the simplicity of someone who had accepted that her past might be read as irrelevant by others. "I teach because there are children," she said. After they left, the camp exhaled. The inspector's notes, later shown to Harris in a curt, philanthropic tone, were positive. There were suggestions: more formal record-keeping, additional security for certain areas, clearer protocols for transfers. None of it was uniquely punitive. None of it was particularly kind. Harris put the suggestions on the shelf with the other papers from headquarters and went back to the women. "You did well," Doyle said that night, clapping him on the shoulder. "You kept them fed and kept the file tidy. That's what they like. Things neat." Harris allowed the compliment to sit. He found himself thinking less of the forms and more of the faces he'd seen during the inspection. The way a child's eyes had narrowed as if testing the world. He thought of the women who had left in the convoy and wondered where they slept that night. As autumn pushed closer, the nights grew colder, and conversations around the bunks turned to future strategies. Some spoke of leaving the country altogether, an absurd, daring idea that felt like prayer. Others planned more immediate escapes, attempting to go to towns where relatives were rumored to be, to present themselves to authorities who might not know them. The very sound of such plans felt subversive, an assertion that they could choose the terms of their existence. One small rebellion took the shape of a garden patch behind the latrine. The soil there was compact, full of old stones, but the women brought up what they could: broken pots, leftover compost, a stolen handful of rich earth from an absent work party. They planted the packets Marta had bartered, setting tiny seeds into the hole and covering them with hands that trembled slightly with hope. Anna tucked a small note into the soil, a child's whisper: "Grow so we can eat." The act few rung the sound of defiance because it was not grand. It simply denied the bleak arithmetic that said they were temporary things. The winter months promised their own tests. Rations would thin. News would arrive more slowly. Letters might be lost or misdirected. The camp's rhythms would harden, unless softened by the small human ordinances that had become their buffer. To guard against those hardening habits, the women made plans, lists of things to remember, shared schedules for fuel, an inventory of skills and who could teach what. They were organizing, not like a military unit, but like a village, aware of each other's fragilities and strengths. One evening, when the sky was the color of old tin and the air had a metallic bite, a new letter came for Anna. She had long expected some communication, more from the way her mind had been occupied than from a true certainty. The envelope trembled in her hand as if it were alive. The handwriting across the front was known. A cousin's looping script that had sent news of firewood and squabbles, and once a joke in the margin. Anna sat on her bunk and opened the letter, the room narrowing into the small circle of light over her knees. The words inside were not a resolution, but a proposal. A place to come, a small house in a town 2 valleys over, where a cousin could make room for one more. There were instructions about a post office, a name to give to the agent, and a plea, soft, urgent, about arriving before a certain date when the cousin's work might change. The letter smelled faintly of coal smoke and the tang of preserved fruit. The decision lay before her like a thin wooden bridge. To go would mean abandoning the people who had become her new family. To stay was to keep the certainty of the camp's small mercies. She could feel each argument as a separate stone under her feet. That night she went to the latrine garden and knelt in the cool dirt. Marta joined her without a word. They planted a small set of beans side by side, pressing the soil gently over the seeds. Anna told Marta the news, watching how Marta's face would not die with envy or resentment, but bent instead toward the arithmetic of choices. "If you go," Marta said at last, "take some paper. Write what you can. If you think of us, write. If you plant, plant our names." Anna held the notebook as if it were a talisman. She felt the tug of 1,000 small obligations. To the women who might one day be tempted to leave without papers, to the child who needed teachers, to herself. In the end, she realized the truth she had been denying, that dignity did not require permanence in place. It required permission to choose. "Tell them I will carry their names," she said, "and when I can, I will send word." Marta smiled, a tired, luminous thing. "Then go," she said, "and leave us a list of seeds." When the morning came, a new list was posted. It contained names, some familiar, some not. It included those who had applied for transfers, those who had requested release, and those selected for relocation by the changing hands of policy. Elise's name was there again, but this time with a note: "Approved, transport arranged." She kissed the small cloth scarf about her neck as if it were a relic. Anna checked her letter twice, a small ritual of verification. Her things were few: the notebook, a tin spoon, a scarf, the packet of seeds Marta insisted she take. She left behind a note pinned inside the seam of the mattress. Only a few words, written quickly. "We planted beans. If you leave, take the map. If you stay, keep the ember." The mattress would carry the message like a buoy. Before she left, she walked the rows one last time. She hugged those who would forgive the leaving, spoke to those who would not. Lieutenant Harris was there, at the edge of the line, an officer who had learned to be present without spectacle. He did not offer bromides. Instead, he pressed something into her hand, a small metal token, plain as a washer. "If you ever need anything," he said simply, "find me. I will speak." Anna tucked the token into her palm and felt its coolness against her skin. It meant nothing in the ledger of authority, but everything in the grammar of human exchange. The trucks were already waiting when she stepped onto the yard. The canvas flaps were rolled up this time. Faces looked out. She climbed up, turning once to take in the camp. The latrine garden, the mess hall where porridge still steamed, the children's crate where Marta had taught. She felt the weight of leaving like a small, steady pressure. When she reached the top of the truck, she looked down and saw Elise, already seated, the wind taking the edge off her scarf. They smiled at each other, an arrangement of support that needed no words. When the truck pulled away, it left behind a field of small motions, hands folding blankets, women stepping aside, that somehow reshaped the camp into a new anatomy. The departure did not break the structure of their days, but it altered the contour of their hopes. For those left, life resumed with the slow precision of those who had learned to bend without breaking. That evening, when the barracks were lit only by the thin flame of a single lamp, Anna's notebook lay open on Marta's chest as she read aloud letters that had arrived for those who remained. The act of reading was a liturgy now, a way to keep names and faces threaded into the possibility of reuniting. The pages were full of lists and recipes and the small arithmetic of survival. Outside, the wind worked its patience through the pines. Inside, conversation turned to the future with a softer intimacy. Decisions had been made, and the trace of those choices made room for the rest. Lieutenant Harris walked the perimeter once more before he slept, his hands empty. He had given his word in ways that sometimes required quiet dissembling, speaking of what he had allowed as if it were common prudence. He had not, and would not, make promises he could not keep. Yet he had stretched the limits of his authority until the edges softened, and the people within those edges could breathe more easily. For him, that was the work. The camp settled into a new rhythm. Some departures had been made, some promises kept. The ember of trust that had been lit in the long arc of daylight flickered but did not die. It found shelter in small tasks and in the stubbornness of people who chose to grow a garden in a place that had not asked them to. For Anna, the road ahead was uncertain and threaded with risk. For those who remained, the day-to-day care became, in itself, an act of resistance. Night deepened. Someone hummed a melody from a place years away. Someone else read, voice low, a line from a letter that had come from a cousin's farm. The sounds braided into the dark, a small chorus against the long shape of uncertainty. And as the camp slept, Lieutenant Harris found his way, unbidden, to the edge of the latrine garden. The soil held the small sweetness of newly planted seeds. He knelt, brushing the dirt with a careful hand, and thought of the women whose names would travel with the trucks, and the women who would stay and replant and teach. He thought of the day when an inspector might return, and whether the record would show merely ordered compliance or the quiet work of human care that had made compliance something other than cruelty. Somewhere beyond the fence, a truck hummed in the distance, carrying those who had chosen or been chosen to take their luck elsewhere. The sound became a part of the night's slow conversation. Inside the barracks, Anna slept lightly, the notebook under her pillow. She dreamed of a small house with a single window. In the dream, Marta's children recited the alphabet in the yard, and the beans she had planted that morning climbed up a crooked trellis. She woke with the feeling of soil under her nails, a residue that was both literal and moral. Morning promised the usual: roll call, meals, work assignments. But it also held, as always, choices: who to trust, where to plant, whether to write or to stay quiet. The women of Camp Crawford had learned that survival was more than a ledger entry. It was a form of creativity enacted in the blanks between orders. And so the camp moved forward, cradling the small mercies it had made, carrying within its fences the possibility that humane treatment, once given, might reshape what people expected of power itself. The war continued in its far fields, indifferent to the gentle constructions being kept alive here. Yet within the barbed edges, a community learned that dignity was less a grant than a practice, repeated, modest, stubborn. A new day was forming, and with it came new letters, new lists, new small departures and returns. The work of living had not ceased. It had only begun anew.